The defendant, Lyle Menendez, is on the witness stand. I'll remind you that you're still under oath. Would you state your name again for the record, please?
Joseph Lyle Menendez.
All right.
Mr. Menendez, I've placed a picture up on the board. Do you recognize that photograph?
That's my dad.
That's a previously marked exhibit, Your Honor. I'll get the number at the break. You were telling us the last thing on Friday about a talk that you had with your father when you were 13 years of age. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And I believe that you told us that you had heard some noises that made you believe that...
Noises for a long period of time, and after a while, I felt that I should talk to my dad about it, and so it took me a couple days, but I finally did. One time when he came up to the bedroom, I heard him, and I sort of spent the day thinking about it, and then I went and I told him.
Okay. Why did it take you... You said you heard the noises for a period of time. Did you immediately think you knew what it was?
No, I didn't know what it was when I was talking to him, really. I just guessed.
Why didn't you go up to him immediately?
Well, I just felt that if I decided to talk to him about it, he would probably beat me up, and he would probably get incredibly angry, and he might hurt my brother. I just wasn't sure what was going to happen, and so I thought about doing nothing. I really did. I felt like at some point I didn't really have a lot of choice. I should just go talk to my dad, and maybe he would talk to me about it. And I felt like he might, and he did.
He did talk to you about it?
Mm-hmm.
Now, when you finally decided to talk to him, did you just go up and confront him right then, or did you prepare in some way?
I prepared just by sitting in my bedroom, and pretty much the same way I...
On the night of August 20th, 1989, a frantic 911 call shattered the calm of Beverly Hills. The voice on the other end was hysterical, choked with panic. It was 21-year-old Lyle Menendez. What he was reporting was unthinkable. He and his younger brother, 18-year-old Eric, had just come home to find their wealthy parents, Jose and Kitty Menendez, no longer living in the family's multi-million-dollar mansion. The scene was devastating, so intense that the first officers on the scene suspected an organized crime hit. At first, the story seemed like a terrible tragedy. Two handsome, privileged sons, now suddenly orphans, left to deal with an unimaginable loss. They appeared on television, looking grief-stricken, lost, and sympathetic. The public saw two young men whose perfect world had been utterly destroyed. But as investigators started digging, the perfect facade began to crack. The brothers' grief seemed to fade pretty quickly, replaced by a shocking, lavish spending spree. And then came a confession, not to the police, but to a therapist, a confession that would blow the case wide open and ignite a legal firestorm. The story was no longer a simple tragedy. It became a battleground of competing narratives, a story of alleged greed versus horrific mistreatment, of privilege versus deep psychological harm. What followed was a trial that turned this case into a national obsession, forcing America to ask a question that still echoes more than 3 decades later. Were Lyle and Eric Menendez spoiled, cold-hearted perpetrators who took their parents' lives for a $14 million inheritance? Or were they victims of serious mistreatment, pushed to the breaking point, who acted just to survive a lifetime of unspeakable secrets? This is the story of the trial that split a nation, To understand the explosion, you first have to understand the pressure cooker. The Menendez family was the picture of the American dream on steroids. Jose Menendez was a force of nature, a Cuban immigrant who came to America with nothing, and through sheer ambition and a relentless drive, clawed his way to the top of the corporate ladder. He was a self-made millionaire, a high-powered executive in the cutthroat world of Hollywood entertainment. By the late 1980s, he was the CEO of Live Entertainment, a video distribution company behind big movies like the Rambo series. The family lived in a sprawling 7-bedroom mansion on Elm Drive in Beverly Hills, a zip code that's basically shorthand for unimaginable wealth. They had luxury cars, a yacht, and a private tennis coach for the boys. From the outside, it was a fortress of success. Jose demanded perfection, not just from himself, but from his sons. Lyle and Eric were pushed relentlessly in school, in sports, in every part of their lives. They were expected to be champions, to be reflections of their father's own towering success. Kitty Menendez, their mother, was a more complicated figure. Once a beauty queen, she was now a homemaker who by many accounts was often depressed and emotionally volatile, trapped in the gilded cage her husband had built. She was also, according to the brothers, a passive enabler of the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface, a darkness no one outside the mansion's perfect hedges could have imagined. On that fateful August night, Jose and Kitty were in the family den, eating ice cream and strawberries while watching a movie. It was a quiet, normal scene, the kind of evening that played out in millions of homes across America. But in this home, the quiet was about to be obliterated. The confrontation was devastating. Jose was hit first, a shotgun blast that ended his life instantly. Kitty, startled, jumped up and ran. She was shot in multiple places. The brothers used 12-gauge shotguns, firing 15 rounds in total. The excessive nature was staggering. The level of intensity felt personal, intimate, and filled with a rage that forensics experts could practically feel in the room. I'm using softened language here because of YouTube's rules, but what investigators found was beyond what anyone could have imagined in such an upscale neighborhood. When police arrived, they found Lyle and Eric outside, appearing distraught. Lyle's 911 call was a masterclass in panic hysteria. He was sobbing, almost incoherent. The initial theory that this was a professional organized crime hit seemed to make sense. Who else would commit such an intense act? The answer, as it turned out, was much closer to home. The perpetrators weren't unknown intruders. They were the very sons who now stood on the lawn, crying for the parents they had just lost. In the immediate aftermath, Lyle and Eric Menendez played the part of grieving sons perfectly. They were the tragic figures at the center of a horrifying Beverly Hills mystery. Surrounded by family and friends, they appeared fragile, their lives shattered. The public and the press gave them their sympathy. How could you not? These were two young men, barely out of their teens, who had just lost everything. But behind the scenes, a very different story was unfolding, one that didn't quite fit the image of grieving orphans. Almost immediately, the brothers started spending their parents' money with a speed that was, to put it mildly, alarming. The river of cash flowing from their father's estate seemed to be the perfect cure for their supposed sorrow. Within weeks of the funerals, Lyle and Eric went on a legendary spending spree. Lyle bought a Rolex and a new Porsche Carrera. Eric, a talented tennis player, hired a full-time live-in tennis coach for $60,000 a year. They invested in a restaurant, traveled, partied, and lived the high life, burning through an estimated $1 million in the first 6 months after their parents were gone. All this spending didn't go unnoticed. While it's true that grief can make people do strange things, the brothers' behavior looked less like numbing the pain and more like celebrating their newfound freedom and wealth. To the detectives on the case, it was a massive red flag. The image of the spoiled rich kids began to form. The motive, it seemed, was becoming crystal clear: greed. They hadn't taken their parents' lives over some organized crime deal. They had done it to get their hands on a $14 million inheritance. The brothers' story started falling apart in other ways too. Their alibi for the night of the incident seemed flimsy, and their timeline didn't quite add up. Police were suspicious, but they didn't have any concrete evidence. There was no weapon and no fingerprints other than their own, which you'd expect to find in the house. For months, the case stalled. The brothers, meanwhile, kept on living like they'd won the lottery. But Eric, the younger and more sensitive of the two, was cracking under the pressure. The weight of the secret was becoming unbearable. He started seeing a psychologist, Dr. L. Jerome Ozell, and it was in these therapy sessions that the wall of lies would finally come crashing down. On October 31st, 1989, Eric Menendez confessed everything. He told Dr. Ozell in chilling detail how he and Lyle had planned and carried out what happened to their parents. He talked about their hatred for their controlling father and their desire to be free. It was, as they had planned it, the perfect crime. But Lyle, paranoid and controlling, insisted on being there for another session. During that explosive meeting, Dr. Ozell, apparently fearing for his own safety, secretly started recording their conversations. Those tapes, filled with incriminating details about the incident, would become the key that unlocked the entire case. But they would also become the center of one of the most intense legal battles in modern history, as the defense fought to keep those secrets confidential. The stage was set for a showdown. The dam of silence finally broke, not with a leak, but with a betrayal. Dr. Ozell's mistress, Judalon Smith, who had been manipulated by the therapist and had even eavesdropped on the brothers' sessions, eventually went to the police. With her testimony and the knowledge of the therapy tapes, investigators finally had what they needed. On March 8th, 1990, Lyle Menendez was arrested. 3 days later, Eric surrendered to police. The public was stunned. The two grieving sons were now the prime suspects, accused of first-degree charges with special circumstances, which made them eligible for the ultimate penalty. The prosecution's theory was simple and powerful. This was a cold, calculated crime driven by pure greed. For months, as the case moved toward trial, this was the only story the public heard. The Menendez brothers were monsters, the definition of spoiled, destructive entitlement. And then their defense attorney, a fierce and brilliant lawyer named Leslie Abramson, dropped a bombshell that would redefine the entire case. The defense's argument wasn't just a denial. It flipped the entire story on its head. Lyle and Eric, Abramson argued, weren't the perpetrators, they were the victims. They hadn't acted out of greed, but out of sheer terror. What happened, she claimed, was the desperate, tragic end to a lifetime of horrific mistreatment at the hands of their father, Jose. I have to phrase it this way so the video doesn't get pulled down, but suddenly, the courtroom was filled with a story so dark it seemed almost unbelievable. Abramson and her team painted a picture of the Menendez household that was nothing like the glittering Beverly Hills facade. They described a home ruled by a tyrant who subjected his sons to years of unspeakable inappropriate conduct, emotional manipulation, and psychological harm. The testimony was gut-wrenching. Eric and Lyle took the stand and, in voices often choked with tears, described years of torment. They spoke of being inappropriately touched by their father from a young age, a secret they were forced to keep under threat of serious consequences. They portrayed their mother, Kitty, not as a willing participant, but as a broken, alcoholic woman who knew what was happening but was too terrified of her husband to stop it. To back this up, the defense brought in a team of psychological experts. They testified that both brothers suffered from severe post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, because of the chronic mistreatment. They argued the brothers were in a state of imperfect self-defense, meaning they honestly believed their lives were in imminent danger, even if that belief wasn't objectively reasonable. They acted, the argument went, not to get rich, but because they genuinely believed their parents were about to harm them, to keep the family's dark secret. The defense presented a stunning psychological profile. Despite being 18 and 21, the brothers were said to be emotionally stunted. Their lavish spending spree, which the prosecution called proof of greed, was reframed as a desperate, childlike attempt to cope with overwhelming psychological distress and fear. This defense was revolutionary. In the early 1990s, the public's understanding of male victims of inappropriate conduct was almost non-existent. It challenged social norms and deeply ingrained prejudices. The prosecution dismissed the mistreatment claims as a complete fabrication, a cynical lie cooked up by two sociopaths to escape the ultimate penalty. The battle lines were drawn. Was this a case of two cold-hearted perpetrators or two deeply damaged victims? The trial had become a national referendum on the very nature of guilt and victimhood. In July of 1993, the first Menendez trial began, and it quickly became more than just a trial. It was a national spectacle. Court TV broadcast the proceedings live, turning American living rooms into jury boxes. Every tear, every objection, every shocking claim was consumed by a captivated public. The trial was a war of narratives. The prosecution methodically built its case for premeditated charges. They played Lyle's dramatic 911 call, arguing it was a performance. They detailed the brothers' wild spending, presenting a clear and simple motive: greed. The most damaging evidence came from the Oziel tapes. Although parts were kept out due to patient-therapist privilege, the portions the jury did hear were damning. In them, the brothers discussed planning what happened with no mention of mistreatment. On the other side, Leslie Abramson orchestrated a powerful and emotional defense that put the entire Menendez family on trial. The centerpiece was the testimony of the brothers themselves. For days, Lyle and Eric sat on the witness stand, weeping as they recounted horrifying details of their alleged mistreatment. Eric's testimony was particularly raw. A psychologist who analyzed it noted that his body language, the pained expressions, the shaking, was consistent with someone reliving real psychological distress. This created what the defense called imperfect self-defense. They argued the constant mistreatment had so warped the brothers' minds that they believed they were in immediate danger even when their parents were just watching TV. This, they contended, should reduce the charge from the most serious offense to manslaughter. Public opinion was split dramatically. Many were swayed by the brothers' emotional testimony, seeing them as tragic figures who finally snapped. Others sided with the prosecution, viewing the brothers manipulative sociopaths using a fabricated story to escape justice. Talk shows and office water coolers buzzed with debate: were they villains or victims? After 6 months of testimony, the juries, each brother had his own, were hopelessly deadlocked. In Eric's case, the jury was split between the most serious charge and manslaughter. Lyle's jury was also divided. In January 1994, the judge was forced to declare a mistrial for both. It was a stunning victory for the defense. Abramson had succeeded in planting reasonable doubt, but the fight wasn't over. The DA immediately announced they would be tried again. This time, though, the rules of the game would be very different. The second trial, which began in late 1995, took place in a different world. The public was experiencing a kind of Menendez fatigue. The initial wave of sympathy had faded, replaced by cynicism. More importantly, the legal landscape inside the courtroom had shifted dramatically against the brothers. Judge Stanley Weisberg made a series of critical rulings that took away the defense's main strategy. He severely limited the imperfect self-defense argument and restricted how much testimony about the mistreatment the jury could hear, ruling that much of it was irrelevant to whether the brothers were in imminent danger. The new jury would hear a much more sanitized version of the family's story. This time, there was only one jury for both brothers, and in a huge tactical shift, Lyle Menendez did not take the stand. In the first trial, their emotional testimony was the heart of the defense. In the second, only Eric testified, leaving Lyle to sit silently, an image prosecutors easily painted as cold and unremorseful. The new prosecutor, David Kahn, presented a streamlined, aggressive case. He relentlessly challenged the mistreatment claims as fabrications. He focused the jury's attention on what happened to Kitty Menendez. He argued that after the first shots at their father, the brothers had a choice. But instead of stopping, Lyle ran to his car to reload his shotgun while his wounded mother crawled away. He then came back and ended her life. That, Kahn argued, wasn't self-defense. It was an execution. Without the full emotional weight of the mistreatment testimony, the defense struggled. The narrative of spoiled, greedy perpetrators, once clouded by doubt, now seemed clear and undeniable to the new jury. The psychological complexities that had hung the first juries were gone, leaving only the cold facts of the case. In 1996, the verdict came in. This time, there was no deadlock. The jury found both Lyle and Eric Menendez guilty of 2 counts of first-degree charges. They were spared the ultimate penalty, but were sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict was a product of its time. The legal system back then had not yet fully embraced the complexities of psychological distress, especially for male victims. The concept of battered person syndrome wasn't even gender neutral in California law yet. Many legal experts now believe that if the trial were held today with our modern understanding of PTSD, the outcome might have been different. But in 1996, the story that prevailed was the one that was simpler and far more damning. They did it for the money. The Menendez brothers were sentenced to life, but the debate they started never really ended. The central question, were they perpetrators driven by greed or victims pushed to the brink, is just as polarizing today as it was 30 years ago. What do you think after hearing the evidence from both sides? Which story do you find more compelling? Let us know in the comments. This case forced a national conversation, and that conversation is still very much alive. For nearly 3 decades, Lyle and Eric Menendez served their time in separate prisons, their story fading into true crime history. Then, something unexpected happened. A new generation, armed with social media, rediscovered the case. On platforms like TikTok, clips of Eric's raw, emotional testimony from the first trial went viral. Young people who weren't even alive when the incident happened began re-examining the case, not through the cynical media lens of the 1990s, but with a modern awareness of psychological harm. The case of Lyle and Eric Menendez has never been just about a verdict. It's about the collision of 2 powerful and compatible stories. One is a story of wealth, privilege, and cold-hearted greed. The other is a story of hidden psychological harm, desperation, and survival. For over 30 years, America has been the jury, debating the motives and struggling to choose between them. The brothers were convicted of taking their parents' lives, yet the questions around their case have only grown more complex. Our understanding of psychology and mistreatment has evolved in ways that were unimaginable during their second trial. Today, Lyle and Eric Menendez are still behind bars, but their story is more alive than ever. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about what happens when the lines between victim and perpetrator get blurry. It challenges our definitions of justice and mercy. The trial that once split a nation continues to do so, leaving us with a legacy of doubt and one haunting question that may never truly be answered. Were they spoiled perpetrators, or were they victims of circumstances beyond their control? The Menendez case remains a mirror reflecting our evolving understanding of justice, victimhood, and the complex ways that childhood experiences can shape adult actions. Whether you see them as calculating criminals or damaged victims may say as much about your own perspective on justice and mercy as it does about the brothers themselves. What's certain is that this case will continue to spark debate and discussion for generations to come, challenging us to examine our assumptions about guilt, innocence, and the true nature of justice in America.